The unseen weight. Why awakening isn't always liberation. You don't choose to be a dark chosen one. That's the first cost. You're claimed by something ancient, something cosmic, something that doesn't ask for permission. It selects you. Not because you're the strongest or the smartest or the most pure. It chooses you because your soul agreed, long before you had a name, to hold a frequency that would burn through illusion, even if it meant burning through you. That's the hidden contract, not the one you read in books or hear in spiritual circles. The real one, the one inked in silence and sealed in pain. Being chosen in the dark doesn't feel like a blessing, not at first. It feels like loss, like exile, like betrayal. Your old life begins to collapse, not because you did anything wrong, but because it's incompatible with who you're becoming. Friends disappear, opportunities vanish. You start to feel like a ghost inside your own timeline. And the most haunting part? Nobody around you understands why. They tell you to stay positive, to trust the process, but they don't see the magnitude of what you're carrying. You're not just healing a wound. You're dissolving entire paradigms. You're dismantling ancestral blueprints. You're purging timelines that never belonged to you. The first hidden cost? Loneliness that doesn't go away just because you're around people. It's the loneliness of energetic misfit syndrome. The isolation of being able to see what others are unwilling to confront. You're in a room full of smiles, but you feel like you're in a war zone because you can sense the unspoken rage, the suppressed grief, the energetic projections. You feel too much. You know too much. And so you begin to shrink. You silence your knowing. You edit your presence. Until one day you realize your silence is not peace, it's self-erasure. That's when the real awakening begins. Not the kind on Instagram, the kind that rips your life apart so your soul can finally breathe. You start to realize that your journey isn't about becoming a healer or a light worker in the traditional sense. It's about becoming a mirror that reflects truth so clearly, it either awakens people or repels them. And that mirror? It's made of your scars, your trauma, your shadow. You don't teach from the mountaintop. You teach from the trenches. And here's where it gets even harder. Your presence starts to trigger transformation that people didn't ask for. You'll walk into rooms and people will get uncomfortable, not because you're unkind, but because you're unkind, but because your energy exposes what they've been hiding from themselves. You become the embodied consequence of their avoidance, and they won't thank you for it. They'll resent you. They'll project onto you. They'll make you the villain in their story because they're not ready to meet their own reflection. This is the second hidden cost. You lose the luxury of being seen clearly. You become mythologized and misunderstood. People either pedestal you or demonize you. Very few will sit with your humanity. Even fewer will ask, "How are you holding all this?" Because they assume you're fine. They assume you're above it. But they don't see the nights where you cry into your own hands. They don't see the moments where you question everything. Your path, your sanity, your purpose. They don't see the fatigue that comes from holding deep frequency in a shallow world. And yet, you keep going. Not because you're fearless, but because something deeper than fear is moving you. Something unseen, something sacred, something that whispers, if not you, then who? And let's talk about the body, because that's another cost nobody talks about. Your body becomes a battlefield. As your vibration increases, density in your physical form has to be purged. That means chronic fatigue, mysterious illnesses, emotional purging that feels like death. Your nervous system becomes a receptor for frequencies most people will never touch in this lifetime. Your DNA starts to rewrite itself. Old trauma stored in your cells rises to the surface, not gently, but like an earthquake, and you still show up. You still love. You still serve. But inside, you're breaking and rebuilding every single day. That's the path. That's the price. You don't get to bypass the body. You become the temple where the divine does its most painful renovation. And maybe the deepest cost of all is this: you become unrecognizable to your past. The version of you who used to laugh at surface jokes, who used to gossip, who used to chase validation, that version dies. And with it, the people who only loved that version of you. You start to notice that your presence no longer fits in the spaces you used to call home. You can't tolerate shallow conversation. You can't fake smiles. You can't betray your soul just to keep the peace. So you start walking away, not out of anger, but out of alignment. And the grief that comes with that, it's not loud. It's quiet and constant. Like a song you can't turn off. You grieve the life you thought you wanted. You grieve the relationships you can't return to. You grieve the innocence that awakening stole from you. But here's the paradox. In all of this loss, you find something you never knew you were looking for. A stillness that doesn't depend on external validation. A power that doesn't need an audience. A clarity that cuts through illusion like a blade. You become dangerous to every system built on lies. Not because you're loud, but because you're clear. You no longer negotiate your intuition. You no longer apologize for your intensity. You no longer dilute your essence just to be palatable. And in that frequency, you begin to attract others who are like you. Not many, but enough. Enough to remind you that you're not the only one. Enough to remind you that the path of the dark chosen one is not just about survival, it's about sovereignty. So if you've been wondering why your life feels like a series of initiations with no rest, why your presence seems to unravel others, why you keep losing things that once defined you, it's not because you're cursed. It's because you're coded to carry a frequency that this world forgot how to hold. Coded to disrupt illusion just by being real. Coded to awaken others, not with your words, but with your wounds alchemized into wisdom. And yes, there's a cost. But there's also a reward, not in gold, not in applause, but in the quiet knowing that you have become exactly who your soul came here to be. The spiritual burnout no one warned you about, when being chosen becomes too heavy. There comes a moment on the path of the dark chosen one when the spiritual weight becomes too much. Not because you're weak, but because the sheer volume of what you've been holding, transmuting, and carrying silently begins to exceed what one person should ever have to bear. And yet, you bear it, not because you want to, but because you can. That's the paradox. You're not broken. You're exhausted. Spiritually, emotionally, psychically drained. And no one sees it. Because you've mastered the art of functioning while falling apart. You've learned to smile while your soul is bleeding. You've learned to hold space for others while your own inner world is collapsing. And that's where the next hidden cost reveals itself. You become invisible in your strength. The world is addicted to visible suffering, to tears and breakdowns and dramatic cries for help. But the kind of pain you carry doesn't make noise. It sits in your bones. It hides behind your eyes. It travels with you like a silent companion. People don't recognize it because you've learned to walk with grace through storms that would drown most. You become so good at holding others that they forget to ask who's holding you. And the truth? Sometimes no one is. Sometimes you're the entire support system for everyone around you while silently wondering if you'll survive the next wave. That's the spiritual burnout no one talks about. The kind that doesn't come from doing too much, but from being too much in a world that prefers you dimmed. And when the burnout hits, it doesn't look like laziness. It looks like soul fatigue. It looks like questioning your path, doubting your gifts, feeling disconnected from everything that once felt sacred. You stop hearing your guides. Your rituals stop working. The visions go silent. You begin to wonder if you've been abandoned, if you misunderstood your calling, if maybe you were never chosen at all. That's the shadow of the path. That's the void that opens when you've poured so much light into others that you forgot to pour any into yourself. And in that darkness, something terrifying happens. You start to lose your sense of self, not in an ego death kind of way, in a depletion kind of way. As if your essence is being siphoned by the very calling you were born to fulfill. This is when many dark chosen ones fall into spiritual depression. Not because they're off path, but because they've been too on path without rest, without replenishment, without reciprocity. We're taught that service is sacred, that sacrifice is noble. But what they don't tell you is that unchecked sacrifice becomes self-abandonment. That martyrdom is not the same as mastery. That being a vessel for divine energy does not mean becoming a void for others to dump their pain into. You are not here to be consumed. You are here to embody. And embodiment requires boundaries. It requires rest. It requires a kind of fierce self-love that refuses to let your light be used as someone else's shortcut to awakening. So how do we survive this burnout? How do we return to ourselves when the path has drained us dry? The answer is not more doing. It's more undoing. You have to unplug from the performance of healing. You have to stop showing up for everyone else and start showing up for the version of you that's curled up in the corner, begging for your own attention. You have to stop chasing your next upgrade and start grieving the parts of you that were sacrificed for initiation. You have to stop consuming more knowledge and start integrating the wisdom that's already sitting in your gut, waiting for you to listen. This is the sacred pause, the void, the womb of your next becoming. And it's not glamorous. It's not Instagrammable. It's quiet, lonely, raw. But it's where your real power returns. Let me ask you something you may have never dared to consider. What if your power isn't in how much you can carry, but in how deeply you can rest? What if your greatest offering isn't what you do for others, but how honestly you can be with yourself? What if the burnout is not a breakdown, but a breakthrough, asking you to stop being the healer, the guide, the channel, and just be human for a while? Because the truth is, even the most awakened soul still lives in a body. And your body needs what your spirit often forgets: nourishment, slowness, softness, play, stillness. The dark path doesn't have to be a path of constant suffering. You're allowed to create space for joy. You're allowed to laugh. You're allowed to be held. You're allowed to say no. And slowly, as you honor the silence, as you stop chasing and start allowing, you feel something shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, but subtly. A thread of warmth returns, a glimpse of clarity, a flicker of your essence whispering, "I'm still here." That's the real medicine. That's the real miracle. Not the visions, not the channeling. Not the ability to hold space for others, but the ability to come home to yourself after being stretched too far for too long. That's what keeps a dark chosen one alive. Not power, not performance, but presence. And presence is born in the moments when you finally choose yourself, even when no one else does. Becoming the sacred rebel who no longer needs to be understood. There comes a point in your journey where you realize that no amount of explaining will ever make people understand what you're carrying. And the deeper truth is, they're not supposed to. That's the final initiation. To stop trying to be understood and start being true. Not in a performative way, not in a spiritual ego way, but in a raw, grounded, soul-deep way that says, even if you never see me, I will no longer abandon myself just to be visible in your sight. That's the sacred rebellion. The moment when you reclaim your full essence, with or without applause, with or without validation, with or without belonging. Because you finally realized your path is not a consensus reality. It's a divine divergence. When you finally let go of needing permission to be who you are, you unlock a frequency of freedom most people will never taste. You stop negotiating your truth. You stop shape-shifting to be digestible. You stop diluting your depth to keep the comfort of others intact. And yes, it's lonely. At first, unbearably so. But then something miraculous happens. You find your people, not because you sought them, but because they recognize your resonance. They don't need you to tone it down. They don't ask you to explain. They just know, because they've walked through the same fire. And that's when you realize the path of the dark chosen one was never meant to make you popular. It was meant to make you precise. And precision is power, not the loud kind. Not the kind that performs for attention, the kind that creates impact in silence, the kind that shifts timelines just by existing. When you walk into a room, energy reorganizes, not because you're trying, but because you've become so aligned with your essence that illusion can't hold itself in your presence. That's the real revolution. To be so true to your own frequency that it becomes a living transmission. Not a brand, not a role, a vibration. And that vibration doesn't need to be validated to be effective. It just is, and it is enough. But to reach that level, you have to lose everything you thought made you special. You have to surrender every identity that gave you safety. You have to let go of the spiritual armor, the performance, the need to be high vibe, the desire to be seen as enlightened. You have to become naked in your truth, unimpressive, unmarketable, juiced real. And that's terrifying, because we've been conditioned to believe that spiritual power must always look powerful. But in reality, it often looks like sitting alone in your room, crying over a wound no one else can see, and choosing, again, not to numb it, not to escape it, but to honor it. That's bravery. That's mastery. That's the medicine this world needs, but rarely recognizes. So let me ask you something, and I want you to sit with this deeply. If no one ever clapped for your healing, would you still choose it? If no one ever saw your gifts, would you still develop them? If no one ever validated your path, would you still walk it? Because that's the question that separates the performative from the authentic, the seeker from the embodiment, the student from the sacred rebel. And when you answer why ease, not from ego, but from soul, you cross a threshold no algorithm can measure. You become untouchable, not because you're above it all, but because you're in it all fully, fiercely, without shame. And this is where your true service begins. Not when you're perfect, not when you're healed, but when you're real. When you can say, I've walked through hell, and I still choose love. When you can hold space for others without abandoning yourself. when you can speak truth without decoration, when you can face rejection without folding. That's what makes you dangerous to the systems built on control, illusion, and fear. Because you're no longer manipulatable. You're no longer seeking safety in the matrix. You've found home within yourself. And that home, it cannot be colonized. It cannot be bought. It cannot be broken. So if you feel like you've lost everything, your community, your clarity, your comfort, know this: you are not broken. You are becoming the version of you that no longer needs to be explained, defended, or justified. Becoming the one your ancestors prayed for, the one your lineage has been waiting on, the one who doesn't just carry light but embodies the sacred dark with dignity, with depth, and with devotion. This is the final cost. But it's also the final liberation. You've come full circle, and now you are free. There's something else we need to talk about, something so few ever say out loud. When you make it this far on the path of the dark chosen one, the journey doesn't get easier. You just get stronger, but not in the way society defines strength. Not in brute force, not in relentless productivity. You become strong in essence, in stillness, in truth. And that truth, it becomes sharp, not violent but surgical. You begin to see clearly what others are still avoiding. You begin to feel when someone's words don't match their energy. You begin to know things before they happen, feel the lies before they're spoken. And that clarity can feel like a burden until you realize it's a sacred weapon, not to harm, but to liberate. Because in a world built on illusion, the most dangerous thing you can be is clear. But here's the hidden cost of that clarity. You will be feared, not because you're harmful, but because you're uncontrollable. You can't be manipulated with guilt. You can't be seduced by fake light. You can't be lured into comfort at the expense of your integrity. And people who are still married to their illusions will feel threatened by that. They'll paint you as too intense, too serious, too deep, too negative. But what they're really saying is, you make me feel what I'm not ready to face. And you must be okay with that. You must stop trying to be safe for others when your soul came here to be sovereign. You must give yourself permission to be the storm that clears the space for something real to grow. This is one of the final costs. You stop being liked and start being real. And realness doesn't always win you applause. It wins you respect from the few who can truly see. And that's enough. Because you'll find that when you stop needing to be liked, you start attracting truth. Truth in relationships, truth in work, truth in your own body. And even though your circle may get smaller, it gets sacred. Every connection becomes a mirror, not a mask. Every conversation becomes a ceremony. You stop wasting time on shallow waters, because you've drowned too many times not to know the depth is where you belong. You don't want more followers, you want more frequency matchers. And they exist. But they only show up when you stop pretending to be someone you're not. Eventually, you realize the path of the dark chosen one was never about darkness for the sake of suffering. It was about going so deep into the dark that you find the original spark, the part of you that no trauma could touch, no lie could bury, no system could silence. That's the real you. The wild, divine, untamed intelligence that remembered the truth even when you forgot your own name. And when you carry that spark back out of the dark, you don't become a savior, you become a frequency holder. A living transmission, not because you're trying, but because you've become. and that becoming. That's what this entire journey was for. So the next time you're sitting in the quiet, wondering why your path has been so heavy, why your life has felt like an endless firewalk, ask yourself this: what version of me was forged in that fire? Because that version, the you that emerged from the silence, the loss, the grief, the exile, that version is untouchable. That version is what you came here to become. And now that you've remembered, the world better be ready.